In 1962, Australian-born British author James Clavell released a novel titled King Rat. It was to be the first of 6 books, which formed what later became known as the Asian Saga, a series of historical fiction novels focusing on European protagonists who made their way to the Asian continent. Iran, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Japan, to be precise. The Asian Saga boasts several acclaimed bestsellers, but it was the 3rd novel in particular that truly left a lasting mark, and not just on Clavell's career as an author. Released in 1975, Shōgun delves into the story of English pilot John Blackthorne and his arrival in Japan, coinciding with the country's fascinating transition from the Warring States period to the Edo period. Despite arguably containing a few historical inaccuracies in regards to Japanese history and culture here and there, Clavell's book undoubtedly managed to bring feudal Japan to life in vivid detail, masterfully exploring the contrast between the island nation's customs, traditions, and mindset with those of the Western world. Remember that this was back in the mid-1970s, long before millions of Westerners like you and me had developed an obsession with everything Japan. There was nothing quite like it up until that point, and for this exact reason, James Clavell's Shōgun has served not only as a captivating read for multiple generations of readers, but also as one of the first pieces of literature, or actually as one of the first pieces of, well, anything that managed to get the Western world interested in Japanese history, culture, and everything in between. As the novel continued to sell millions upon millions of copies over the years, the story of John Blackthorne managed to go way beyond just printed letters, inspiring the creation of countless other creative projects based on its premise, including a musical,
breathtaking beauty, epic grandeur, James Clavell's Shōgun, the spectacular musical adventure,
a video game, a 1980 TV miniseries,
John Blackthorne, the one man with the power to change Japan's destiny for all time.
And most importantly, and most likely the reason why you decided to click on this video in the first place, the absolutely brilliant 2024 FX drama series starring the equally brilliant Sanada Hiroyuki. If you haven't watched it yet, go ahead and give it a shot. The hype is definitely justified. Without a doubt, James Clavell's Shōgun has become a certified classic over the past 5 decades, one that has proven to be both culturally impactful and creatively inspiring. But what was it that inspired Clavell to come up with this near 1200-page masterpiece? Well, actually, the story of John Blackthorne, while obviously fictitious, is rooted much deeper in actual history than one might think. That is because it is very much based on the life of William Adams, an English navigator who not only became the first Englishman to ever reach Japan, but who also ended up staying in Japan for 2 whole decades, forging a remarkably close relationship with the country's most powerful leader, fully embracing a country and culture that could not have been more different from what he experienced back home, and arguably becoming the most legendary foreigner that ever lived in Japan. In today's video, we travel from a small town in southern England all the way to the land of the rising sun, guided by the real story of the Anjin.
You must be the Anjin.
What does that mean?
It means pilot.
One that, while certainly less action-packed, is not that much less interesting than what James Clavell and the creators of the 2024 FX adaptation were able to come up with. If this video ends up teaching you something new, or even if it just kept you entertained for a couple of minutes, make sure to smash that gorgeous like button and subscribe for even more Japanese history and organized crime content. For those of you who really enjoy my videos, consider checking out my Patreon page where you can support me for as little as $1 per month. But enough about me, we got an Anjin to talk about here. This is the story of William Adams, from English castaway to Japanese lord. William Adams' long but fascinating journey begins in 1564 in Gillingham, situated on the southeastern coast of England in a county called Kent. After his father's death, the 12-year-old William made his way to East London's Limehouse district to prepare for life as a seafarer. He spent the next 12 years of his life as an apprentice of shipyard owner Master Nicholas Diggins, honing his navigation, shipbuilding, and astronomy skills, and completing his apprenticeship in 1588. Over the following years, Adams collected valuable experience as a ship captain, commanding a transport ship that resupplied the British fleet that fought the Armada during the Anglo-Spanish War of the late 16th century. After multiple years of service, he retired from the Royal Navy and instead started working for the London Company of Barbary Merchants, involved in trade on the North African Barbary coast. It was also during his time with the Barbary merchants that William Adams first developed an interest in the Dutch trade with India, and so, in 1598, now 34 years old and with 10 years of experience as a seafarer under his belt, he and his brother Thomas successfully applied for an expedition to the Far East, led by a group of Dutch merchants from the port city of Rotterdam. Their fleet consisted of a total of 5 ships, called Hope, which was also the ship that William boarded, Liefde, formerly known as Erasmus, Geloof, Trouw, and Blijde Boodschap. The plan for the expedition was as follows: sail to the South American west coast, exchange goods for silver, and return to Europe. Should this plan fail for some reason, the expedition was supposed to head for Japan, obtain some silver there, use it to buy spices in the East Indonesian Moluccas, and then return to Europe. Sounds like a good plan, doesn't it? But from the get-go, there were whispers of nervousness amongst some expedition members. After all, their journey involved sailing the notorious Strait of Magellan, infamous for its brutal weather conditions. Undeterred, the expedition set sail from Rotterdam in June of 1598. Right from the start, the fleet encountered several problems. Upon arriving at Cape Verde in August of that same year, a mere 2 months after setting sail from Holland, the expedition was plagued by severe food shortages and a fever that spread among members of the Hope, including the expedition leader, who passed away as a result. Eventually, all sick crew members had to be left behind in Africa in order to recover, but by January of 1599, the expedition had pressed on. William Adams, having switched ships from the Hope to the Liefde, continued the voyage aboard a new vessel. By March of 1599, the expedition had reached the Argentinian Rio de la Plata, and by April, 10 months after leaving Rotterdam, they had finally arrived at the Strait of Magellan, the biggest obstacle yet. Due to harsh winds and freezing temperatures, only 3 of the 5 ships managed to make it through the strait. The Liefde, which included William Adams as a crew member, waited for the other 2 remaining ships, the Hope and the Trouw, off the coast of Ecuador. The Trouw never made it there, eventually arriving in Indonesia, where its crew was murdered by the Portuguese in 1601. Only the Liefde and the Hope remained, both ships bearing the scars of the journey. They had lost not only both captains, but also William Adams' brother, Thomas. But undeterred by these losses and spurred on by the looming threat of Spanish capture, the remaining crew pressed on and in November of 1599 set sail across the vast Pacific Ocean, aiming for the shores of Japan. The following 6 months didn't get any easier. Along the way, several crew members decided to leave the expedition while making landfall on a set of islands believed to be Hawaii. But even worse, the Hope, along with all of its crew members, was decimated by a typhoon in February of 1600. Nearly 2 years after its departure from Rotterdam, the battered Liefde and its crew, the sole survivors of the original expedition, finally reached the shores of Japan on April 19th, 1600. But what remained could barely be described as a crew. Only 9 members were actually strong enough to make it onto shore, including the main protagonist of our story, William Adams. Adams and his fellow survivors landed in what was then known as Bungo Province, part of Japan's southernmost island of Kyushu. They were then found and taken care of by locals of the area, who informed their lord of the nearly dead foreigner's arrival. And apparently, after a grueling voyage, the crew was initially met with a warm welcome, enjoying a much-needed respite during their first days in Japan. Their well-deserved rest, however, was soon interrupted by the arrival of Portuguese missionaries. They claimed that William Adams and the rest of the crew were actually pirates, and so they should be swiftly executed as such. Did the Portuguese missionaries actually believe that they were pirates, or were they just mad at the fact that an Englishman, accompanied by a couple of Dutch sailors, had arrived in what they considered to be their turf? Hard to say, but to be fair, the new arrivals were reportedly packing some serious heat. Around 5,000 cannonballs, 500 muskets, and 300 chain shots. Sounds kinda piratey to me as well, I gotta admit. Now, the Portuguese missionaries did manage to get Adams and his crew thrown into a much nastier prison for a few days. But then something extraordinary happened. William Adams and Jan Joosten, a Dutch merchant and fellow Liefde crew survivor, were invited to travel to Osaka Castle on orders from a very, very important man who was in the process of reunifying a Japan that was divided by war. A man who was about to become the country's next shogun, basically the most powerful person in all of Japan in just a few years' time. Tokugawa Ieyasu. Ieyasu was fascinated by William Adams in particular. Over the following 2 months, the two met at Osaka Castle on 3 different occasions. The man from Gillingham captivated the Japanese lord with his vast knowledge of shipbuilding, navigation, mathematics, and the Western world. So much so that the future shogun decided to reject the Portuguese missionaries' persistent demands for Adams and his companions to be executed. This is probably also the perfect time to mention the not so unimportant fact that William Adams also had a wife and a kid waiting for him back home in England, because it is also a letter sent to his wife that gives us a pretty good glimpse into what these meetings might have looked like. Quote, "Coming before the king, he viewed me well and seemed to be wonderfully favorable. He made many signs unto me, some of which I understood and some I did not. In the end, there came one that could speak Portuguese. By him, the king demanded of me what land I was, and what moved us to come to this land, being so far off. I showed unto him the name of our country, and that our land had long sought out the East Indies, and desired friendship with all kings and potentates in way of merchandise, having in our land diverse commodities, which these lands had not. Then he asked whether our country had wars. I answered him, yeah, with the Spaniards and Portugals, being in peace with all other nations. Further he asked me in what I did believe. I said in God that made heaven and earth. He asked me diverse other questions of things of religions and many other things, as what way we came to the country. Having a chart of the whole world, I showed him, through the Strait of Magellan, at which he wondered and thought me to lie. Thus, from one thing to another, I abode with him till midnight." Regarding his ongoing beef with the Portuguese missionaries, he wrote the following. In the end, the emperor gave them answer that as we yet had not done to him nor to none of his land any harm or damage, therefore against reason or justice to put us to death. If our countries had wars the one with the other, that was no cause that he should put us to death, with which they were out of heart that their cruel pretense failed them, for which God be forever praised. So far, he had good reason to be grateful, but while Adams was having audiences with the future shogun, he was not yet a free man. Him and the whole Liefde crew were still considered to be prisoners, but only a few months after first arriving in Japan, Ieyasu made them an offer that they, I guess literally, couldn't refuse. They were offered to be freed in exchange for their services during an upcoming, very important civil war that the future shogun was involved in. William Adams proved to be a valuable asset to the Tokugawa army. The Englishman instructed them in the use of artillery with the help of 19 bronze cannons salvaged from the Liefde, and beyond that even shared with them his knowledge of navigation and astronomy. Reportedly, the Englishman also witnessed firsthand the Tokugawa forces in action during a campaign in Aizu, and later accompanied them on their march westwards, where a pivotal battle, destined to shape the course of Japanese history, was about to take place. This epic encounter, known as the Battle of Sekigahara, would unfold in October of 1600. It was the outcome of this battle which ultimately ended the Warring States period and soon ushered in a new era of Japan, with Tokugawa Ieyasu at the helm as its undisputed leader. But the victory of the Eastern Army under Tokugawa Ieyasu also brought significant advantages for William Adams. For his services, he was generously rewarded, receiving a payment of 10,000 Portuguese reals following the Battle of Sekigahara. But the real kicker came a couple of years later, when Adams, now a direct diplomatic advisor to the shogun, received his very own domain on the Miura Peninsula just south of Edo, the predecessor of modern-day Tokyo. The Englishman's Miura domain was also inhabited by what Adams himself described as, quote, 80 or 90 husbandmen, that be my slaves or servants, end quote. Furthermore, the Englishman had a daily allowance of 1 kilogram of rice, plus a monthly allowance of 50 ryo. Converting Edo period currency into modern currency seems to be an almost impossible task, but from what I was able to gather with a bit of research, 1 early Edo period ryo seems to have been worth around 130,000 yen in today's money, or let's say around $800 US. Therefore, Adams should have had somewhere around $40,000 per month in today's money to spend to his heart's content. Just barely enough to make ends meet, I guess. But far from content with a life of leisure, William Adams continued to demonstrate his value. For example, he actively participated in Japan's foreign trade endeavors. A mansion Ieyasu bestowed upon him in Edo was strategically situated near Uruga Harbor, a key gateway to Edo Bay, perfectly positioned to facilitate his involvement in such ventures. From here, he took care of whatever was brought in by foreign ships, and he reportedly had resale rights on cargo coming in from countries like Spain, not only making him an influential figure in Edo's trade business, but probably making him a pretty penny as well. Speaking of Spanish ships, it is said that the very first Spanish merchant ship was brought into Edo Bay by none other than William Adams himself in 1603. And allegedly, it was also around this time that the freshly appointed Shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu, watching in awe as Adams safely brought the Spanish ship into the harbor of Edo, started referring to the Englishman not as William Adams, but as Anjin, the Japanese word for pilot, a testament to his seafaring skills. 2 years later, William Adams' reputation reached even greater heights. In a move that surprised everyone, Tokugawa Ieyasu bestowed upon him the singular honor of a lordship, probably an unprecedented recognition for a foreigner in Japan at that time. To be precise, Adams was made a so-called hatamoto, or bannerman, which also meant that he was now a direct retainer to the shogun and his court. The story goes that Tokugawa Ieyasu presented the Englishman with 2 swords, declaring that William Adams had passed on. In his place stood Miura Anjin, a name that blended the title of the domain bestowed upon him with the Japanese word for pilot. This new identity signified Adams' complete integration into Japanese life and his enduring role as a bridge between cultures. But the man from Gillingham didn't stop there either. In 1604, he aided the construction of a series of Western-style ships, the first of their kind in Japan, and according to Adams himself, Ieyasu was very pleased with the result. After receiving all these great gifts, job opportunities, and the respect of the country's most powerful man, it is hardly a surprise that William Adams was quite enamored with Japan and its people. To once again quote the man himself, "The people of this land of Japan are good of nature, courteous above measure, and valiant in war. Their justice is severely executed without any partiality upon transgressors of the law. They are governed in great civility. I mean not a land better governed in the world by civil policy. The people be very superstitious in their religion and are of diverse opinions." However, staying in Japan for the rest of his life was actually not in Adams' personal plans. In fact, everything that was given by Ieyasu to William Adams could be seen as an attempt to persuade the Englishman, who made countless unsuccessful requests to return home to England. As the years went by, most of his fellow expedition crew members had received permission to go back home, but Adams himself was never even given the option of going back. One especially desperate appeal to return home was met by the shogun with a straightforward, blunt answer, quote, "I will not let you go away. Settle in my country permanently." Now, Adams did eventually find a way to at least make regular support payments to his wife and child back home. But little did he know that he would never see his beloved England ever again. Now, as tragic as this part of William Adams' life story is, his life in Japan wasn't exactly all doom and gloom either. I mean, as we've already established, the guy was insanely rich, insanely respected, and he had more than enough work to keep him busy for the rest of his life. But most important of all, he also ended up having a wife and kids in Japan. His Japanese wife was the daughter, or according to some sources, the adopted daughter, of a certain Magome Kagiyu, a highway official in charge of a pack horse exchange near Edo. His daughter's real name is actually unknown. Most stories about the life of William Adams refer to her simply as Yuki or Oyuki, a name that is very likely to be completely fictional. But for the sake of keeping it simple, and also because her name isn't really that important, let's just go with Yuki for the rest of this video. Now, the idea of an arranged marriage between her and the Anjin was actually the brainchild of the shogun himself, but Adams is said to have taken a full year to decide whether to go through with it or not. It seems that Adams and Yuki did legitimately like each other, but there were several other reasons why they ended up getting married. Yuki's family was financially secure, but they weren't nobility or part of the social elite or anything. For them, a marriage between her and a man with samurai status obviously seemed like a pretty good idea. As for Adams, this guy took a lot of convincing to go through with the whole marriage thing. But in the end, he agreed mainly to please the shogun. And because he had been told that it would be smart to have a wife to manage his domain while he was gone for multiple weeks or even months on end due to his work for the Tokugawa shogunate. And so, Yuki and William, who was now 41 years of age, finally got married in June of 1606. Their first child, a boy who received the name Joseph, followed a year later in 1607, and in 1613, Yuki gave birth to a girl named Susanna. Surely, a wife and kids must have been enough to make William give up on his dream to return to England, right? Well, not really, because Adams only agreed to the marriage under one more condition. Yuki had to agree to let him return back home if given the chance. Just think about it. In Japan, William Adams had everything. Money, land, a prestigious title, a reportedly beautiful wife, 2 kids, and yet he always held onto his dream of one day returning to his home country, where he had no fancy titles or riches to his name. This enduring desire truly speaks volumes about his deep devotion to both his homeland and his loved ones there. But for the time being, he had no choice but to make the most of his time in Japan, and he certainly did just that. All the way back in 1604, in an attempt to bring more Western trade to Japan and to give the Portuguese some competition, Tokugawa Ieyasu sent a ship to establish contact with the Dutch East India Company, which had just set up warehouses in Patani, a historical region located between modern-day Thailand and Malaysia. Though ongoing conflicts with the Portuguese delayed their endeavors, the Dutch were finally able to establish proper trade relations with the Japanese, setting up a trade factory on Hirado Island off the coast of Kyushu a couple of years later, in 1609. The Dutch also had something that neither the Portuguese nor the Spaniards had: the right to freely trade and travel throughout all of Japan. William Adams, being a trusted advisor to the shogun, was instrumental in making this happen in the first place, and it seems like he was quite proud of his achievement too. Quote, "The Hollanders be now settled, and I have got them that privilege, as the Spaniards and Portugals could never get in this 50 or 60 years in Japan." And honestly, he had every right to be proud. The significance of the Dutch-Japanese trade facilitated by William Adams cannot be overstated, because even during Japan's period of self-imposed isolation that would soon follow, the Dutch connection established with the help of Adams remained a vital, albeit limited channel for trade between the two nations. In 1611, not long after bringing Dutch trade to Japan, Adams found out that for the preceding 9 years, there had been a nearby settlement set up by the English East India Company in Banten, Indonesia. He sensed 2 golden opportunities here. Obviously, helping his fellow countrymen in establishing trading posts in Japan was of great interest to him. But most importantly, through the settlement, he would finally be able to contact his family back home. He attempted to do so previously through the Dutch, but they more or less betrayed the poor guy, and actually the reason is pretty straightforward. The English were a fierce rival to the Dutch, in terms of trade at least, and should they find out that one of their fellow countrymen had as much sway in Japan as Adams did, they could enter the Japanese market big time. And so, the Dutch made damn sure that Adams' letters never reached their intended destination. Well aware of this stab in the back, the Miura Anjin contacted the English settlement, telling them just how much money the Dutch were making in Japan and that the English, with his help, could do the exact same thing. Obviously, the East India Company would never pass up a chance to make some dough. And so, in June of 1613, English captain John Saris arrived on Hirado Island, where the Dutch had set up a massive trade factory a few years prior. By September, after a meeting with Ieyasu, the English were granted pretty much the same rights that the Dutch had. A big success for both Adams and Captain John Saris. But actually, there were some serious tensions between the two. Long story short, these two guys did not get along from the get-go. Because though both were Englishmen, there seemed to be a rift, perhaps even a cultural one between them. On multiple occasions, Captain Saris invited Adams to stay with him and the other English visitors of the East India Company, but for unknown reasons, Adams declined them all. Most historians believe that William Adams, after 13 years in Japan, and allegedly even being quite fluent at speaking the language at that point, had simply become too accustomed to the Japanese way of living. And the statement by Captain Saris certainly supports this claim. He said that Adams, quote, made so admirable and affectionated commendations of the country, as it is generally thought among us that he is a naturalized Japanese." End quote. Reportedly, Adams also advised his fellow countrymen to learn the local rules and manners. But Saris wouldn't have it, giving the Anjin a serious case of second-hand embarrassment. In turn, Adams bluntly but honestly criticized the cargo that the English had brought to Japan, telling them straight up that their stuff would not make them much money on the Japanese market. Saris viewed this as personal criticism. This was all before they spent months traveling together, by the way. Just imagine how awkward and tense that whole journey must have been. And just to put into perspective how awkward things must have been between the two, Adams had finally managed to obtain permission by Ieyasu to return to England. But he didn't go for it. Because, well, he would have had to go there together with Captain Saris. And to Adams, that was out of the question at that point. Quote, "The reason I would not go with him was for diverse injuries done against me, which were things to me very strange and unlooked for." Instead of finally fulfilling his dream of returning to England, Adams signed a contract with the newly established English East India Company trading factory in Hirado. This move, while financially rewarding him with a hefty salary, suggests a deeper acclimation to Japanese life than he himself might have initially recognized. Who knows, perhaps the opportunity to work with fellow countrymen whose name wasn't John Saris while remaining in his adopted home proved to be a compelling compromise. That being said, while the Miura Anjin never made it as far as good old England, he did leave Japan on multiple occasions, though his travels were limited to Southeast Asia and oftentimes related to his work with the English East India Company, which by the way never really managed to gain a foothold in Japan during its 10 years of existence. What kept the company alive in Japan during these years were in large part William Adams's highly profitable trade expeditions throughout Southeast Asia, which included 3 voyages to Siam between 1614 and 1617, and 2 voyages to Cochin China in 1618 and 1619, respectively. Years earlier, there were also talks about a potential expedition to the Northeast Passage of Asia, a potential, much quicker sailing route between Europe and Asia that Tokugawa Ieyasu himself was quite interested in. That particular expedition never materialized, but it showed that even while approaching his 50s, William Adams still had the spirit of an adventurer lurking within him. Unfortunately though, Adams' 1619 trip to Cochin China was to be his final adventure. It was during this particular expedition that the now 54 years old Miura Anjin contracted a tropical disease that saw his health decline rapidly. Less than a year later, on May 16, 1620, William Adams passed away on Hirado Island at the age of 55. All of his possessions were to be evenly distributed between his families in both Japan and England. This included his house in Edo, his domain on the Miura Peninsula, and of course his lordship and the prestigious title of Miura Anjin, which were actually transferred to his now 13-year-old son Joseph by the new shogun, Tokugawa Hidetada. I call him the new shogun, but he had actually held the title for 15 years at that point, due to his father abdicating the post in his favor all the way back in 1605. But as was so often the case for both emperors and shoguns throughout Japan's long history, it was the predecessor who actually pulled the strings, and Ieyasu was no exception. Following Ieyasu's death in 1616 though, his son Hidetada fully embraced the title of shogun, and as a consequence, William Adams quickly lost a lot of political sway within the shogunate, because Hidetada was nowhere near as interested in foreigners, and Adams for that matter, as his late father was. Seemingly, he was also indifferent enough towards the whole situation to let Joseph and the rest of his family hold on to their status and possessions though. Joseph Adams truly followed in his father's footsteps. He became a trader and, just like Williams, made multiple voyages to Siam and Cochin China starting in 1624. The historical trail regarding Joseph and his family goes cold after 1635 though, and there is a very unfortunate reason for it too. In the 1630s, under the leadership of Ieyasu's grandson and 3rd Tokugawa shogun Iemitsu, a century of foreign travel, trade, and religious influence in Japan came to a sudden end. Missionaries and Christians were persecuted, and pretty much every European was expelled from the country. Those of mixed race were no exception, and that is very likely what ended up happening to both Joseph Adams and his sister Susanna. To be more specific, they most likely ended up in what is now the Indonesian capital, Jakarta, a place that was reserved for expelled children of Dutch or English traders who, along with anything of foreign origin, were no longer tolerated by the Tokugawa shogunate. It was the beginning of Japan's infamous Sakoku, the country's 2 centuries-long isolation from the rest of the world, which made travel to and from Japan impossible. This period also saw foreign trade limited to one tiny island, reserved exclusively for the Dutch and the Chinese, called Dejima, making stories like that of the legendary Miura Anjin an absolute impossibility for centuries to come. The story of William Adams, when you really think about it, is as tragic as it is epic. From growing up in England without a father, to barely surviving a dangerous voyage to the other side of the globe, to serving as the advisor to what is arguably Japanese history's most well-known leader, it's easy to view Adams's life as one filled with incredible luck and fortune. And yet, while the man undoubtedly achieved great things in Japan, he never forgot about England, which perfectly encapsulates what, in my eyes, might be his most defining character trait. William Adams's biography and letters suggest that material possessions and social standing held less significance for him than other qualities. And perhaps it was this very characteristic, a focus on values beyond wealth and status, that also resonated with Tokugawa Ieyasu. Maybe the shogun's deep respect for Adams extended beyond his technical skills and encompassed his overall character. Either way, William Adams, the Miura Anjin, went down not only in Japanese, but in world history as a legend. For proof, look no further than his hometown of Gillingham. Every September, the town comes together to hold a William Adams festival in honor of the Anjin. But there's more. William Adams has had his own monument in Gillingham since 1934, a roundabout named after him, and 2 streets, Ito Way and Yokosuka Way, named after 2 Japanese cities that also became official sister cities of Gillingham, due to their connection to Adams. The Miura Anjin hype is just as palpable in Japan. Within Tokyo's Nihonbashi district, where his Edo mansion once stood, you'll also find a monument dedicated to him, located on Anjin-dori, a whole street named after the guy. A second monument designated as a National Historic Site can be found at what was once the location of his residence in Hemi, his very own domain. Ito, one of the aforementioned sister cities to Gillingham where Adams famously constructed Japan's first Western-style ships, also hosts its own annual Miura Anjin Festival. Then of course there's James Clavell's best-selling novel based on the life of William Adams, the TV shows, the video games, and I'm not only talking about that janky-looking 1989 Shogun game. My personal favorite non-From Software Souls-like, Neo, based its main character off none other than William Adams. And if that doesn't prove that even 400 years later the man is gone but certainly not forgotten, then I don't know what will. Any other notable foreigners in Japan that you can think of that I should cover in a future video? Drop your recommendations in the comments. Also, as usual, let me give a shout out to my loyal Patreon supporters listed here, including Busner, Bobby Wu, Mark Takagi, Javier Soravia, Capybara Chuck, Turom, Daniel Dees, RK0, White Gilden, Justin Down, Yoko the Space Whale, Steve Matsui, Tori and Gales, and Cats in Soup. And to everyone who took their time to watch all the way until the end, as always, thank you so much for watching. Sayonara.